Chapter 51. He waited for the dust to settle, but it didn't. Fighting the suffocating smog, he helped the stranger to his feet and wrapped the man's arms around his neck. He moved him as far away from the devastation as he could. Anywhere would be safer than here. Aside from the emergency services who were struggling to see each other through the dust bomb, there was no movement. They found a deli. It was empty of staff and customers, but a fire crew had taken refuge from the cloud and were quickly taking on water. The man Steve was supporting had sagged after running for his life and was now no longer capable of walking. With the help of the firemen, Steve propped him against an inside wall and went to the fridge for water. There wasn't any, so he took a bottle of Gatorade to the man who Steve knew it was now his responsibility to keep alive. The firemen ran outside in response to a whistle. Regrouping with their team in the street, they went back towards what remained of the towers. The two men were alone. Steve dabbed the face of his charge with tap water, desperately encouraging him to drink something. Where there had been movement before, now there was none. Where there had been breath, Steve felt nothing. There was no sound. Instinct kicked in. Steve tried to bring him back using basic CPR training. He continued to try, but the man was unresponsive. His attempts to call 911 all failed, as there was no network. He tried again and again, 911, 911. Today's date, how ironic. But the fight for this poor soul was now over. All efforts to raise help and use his basic medical knowledge to bring the bloke back had failed. There was nothing Steve could now do. The stranger was gone. There were no medics, there was nobody else, and Steve sat alone with the man's body, close enough that he could hold his cold hand. A final act of compassion. Not knowing the stranger's name, he reached into the man's pocket for an ID, finding a work badge. He assumed that the man was a white guy so covered in dust that Steve had no reason to assume he was anything else. But Irfan Shahad now looked nothing like the Arab man in the photograph. Steve closed Irfan's eyes and said a prayer over his body. It didn't seem to matter what god he prayed to, but it felt like the appropriate thing to do. He looked behind the counter for any means of which to communicate with the outside world. Although the deli telephone was on the floor, it had a dial tone, so he once more tried the same set of numbers. The network might be working by now, and just maybe he'd find Jared. Nothing. Then, Isla. Nothing. He phoned Greta at home in London. He had a ringtone, but the line rang out and went to answer phone. He hung up. Picking up a pad and pen that an hour earlier had been used by the staff to take breakfast orders, Steve wrote a note to leave with Irfan. He struggled for the right words, and for the first time in the 90 minutes of chaos, he cried. It was intense and uncontrollable, the sort of tearful fit that makes a body shake. He lay alone on the floor, once again holding the hand of the stranger who had spent his last moments on earth hoping Steve would save him. He calmed to a point where he could now focus clearly on the pen in his hand. The tears would stop long enough that he could write what he needed to. He couldn't leave until this was done. To whoever finds this message, my name is Stephen Lewis. I tried to help Mr. Irfan Shahid, but could not save him. I was with him at the end. The last thing I can do for him is to let his loved ones know that he wasn't alone. Please contact me if you want to. I'm so sorry I could not do more. He left his details before putting the note into Irfan's pocket along with his work pass. He wiped his face and started to walk into the newly devastated world beyond the door. As he reached the hastily erected perimeter, Steve turned to look at the mess he'd come through. He heard the rumbling noise. He recognised it from earlier, though it wasn't as deafening at this distance. This was the moment the North Tower fell. It imploded in the same way and followed its southern sister to the ground. A new wave of terrified people came towards Steve from the wreckage. Some were hanging onto the outside of retreating emergency vehicles, shouting encouragement to the people on foot that they should run faster to escape the next cloud. The progress through the crowds was slow enough that a few of the stronger and more able men held their hands down to pull people in need from the ground to the back of the fire engine. Whether suited in uniform or just in casual clothes, whether black or white or any colour underneath, everybody looked the same. They were all coated in a mess of filthy powder. Even the media crews were covered in the same dust as the tragic victims on whom they were reporting. Some were lucky enough to have water. Others were picked up by medics who attached oxygen masks to their faces. Bags of rubbish on the street were covered in dust, making them difficult to distinguish from the many victims Steve had seen. People screamed, people cried, and some people fell to their knees amongst the filth and prayed. His phone beeped. He had walked into a signal zone that allowed enough connection for his phone to fill with messages. Everybody in the world knew someone in New York City, and these messages were fortunate enough to have successfully fought their way through the overloaded system. He looked for a message from Jared. There was nothing. Nobody on the 106th floor could have survived. There was nothing from Isla, and none of the other messages mattered. He tried to connect again to Jared. Nothing. He sent a simple message. Are you okay? He received a sending error. The network had crashed again. He didn't know where to go or what to do. He was filthy. His lungs were full of dust and his breathing was tight and painful. Once more, he stopped to cough with the intensity of a seriously sick man. He continued to walk in the direction the emergency traffic was heading, somehow reaching the Hudson River where a large crowd was gathered. People pointed at him and some offered support. He stumbled to the water's edge. If there was a point where he could, Steve would have jumped into the cold, dirty water just to wash the dust off. And in that moment of anguish, despite an unknown number of strangers losing their lives, he didn't care whether he lived or died. Steve kept walking. He stopped at the first public toilets he came to and cleaned up as much as he could. With his body cleaner, his head started to feel a little clearer. Although he was still walking, he didn't have a plan, so sat on an unoccupied bench and stared over the water to Hoboken. He could make out the huge crowd of people on the far riverbank and watched it grow. The dust cloud billowed over the landscape like expanding foam, continuing to circle lower Manhattan and beyond. With each glance, he saw Jared and Irfan. He saw two planes. He saw it all, playing like a film in his head. Some people tried to engage with his emotionless shell. He stared over the mayhem on the water as the mass evacuation of New York took hold. Most people kept a respectful distance from a man in such obvious grief in a city full of similarly damaged souls. They had a raw, visceral view into an intensely private matter. The ones who approached him were kind. They wanted to give support. Every human dot on the landscape was writing its part in the unfolding page of history. He had seen far too much to digest and had no response to any of the strangers offering help and kind words. How could he describe being with Irfan at the moment of his death? And there was still nothing from Jared. Steve would do anything for his next words to be with his friend. Whenever his gaze over the river filled with evacuation vessels was broken, Steve would once again try and consistently fail to connect to the phone numbers. The shock of what he had witnessed just did not want to dissipate, and he did not know how to make the pain stop.